As we kind of already ran into this evening, yes, the schedule did change. So we're just going to keep plugging on, and I'll give you the new schedule. So it is.
You can actually, if you print it out and give it to Peggy, I got to come in tomorrow.
Okay.
I'll get it from Peggy.
Yeah.
Okay.
That'll work
tonight.
And we'll. But we're going to continue in Luke 9. We're not going to finish out the chapter. However, we're going to get pretty close to it. I think there's like 6 verses left in chapter 9 that we'll hit next week before we jump into chapter 10. But this week, as we started doing last week, we're going to look at 2 of the 12 and the next 2 of the next set of brothers. And so it's James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Not as famous as Peter, just because Peter likes drawing attention to himself. He speaks before he thinks, but so do these 2 brothers. There's a lot of instances across the 4 Gospels where James and John open their mouth and they insert their foot pretty quickly. And we kind of see that a little bit this week with some of the questions and statements they say to Jesus, and Jesus has to correct them. And so there's always some confusion, especially when you see pictures like this where John is much older than James, even though John's the younger brother. Christian art has this weird thing where it tries to depict them as close to their death as possible. And James was the second apostle to die. And he only is second to Judas, and that's because Judas killed himself. That's not really super important to who James and John are. But James is the first martyr, or the first apostle martyred. He's killed by Herod Agrippa I in Jerusalem because James at the time is the head honcho of the church in Jerusalem. He may not be the one who's necessarily preaching all the time, because we know Peter does a lot of that, or at least he's recorded doing a lot of that. However, James seems to be the one holding everything together, and then he is killed, and everyone starts scattering. But I included a few others, like Peter, that James and John don't understand what the kingdom of God's really about, what the power of God's really supposed to be used for. We see that with, they always, one of the big examples is Jesus, who will be the one to sit on your right and to sit on your left at the end of time? Who is the greatest of us? Will John be the one who's going to live until the end, or to the second coming, which we get very briefly in the end of John's gospel? But they don't say John. It's, would your beloved, or the disciple who you love most, is he going to be the one who's going to live to the end of the, live until the end? But that's something that people still wrestle over. It was like, was John still alive? Well, most scholars say John did die around 80 AD, which sounds like I'm saying the same word, but it's 80 AD. And so he's the last remaining of the apostles. Tradition holds that John wrote the Gospel of John, the Epistles of John, and Revelation. However, scholars have started questioning that just because they keep finding other manuscripts of some of the things that they thought was written later, and it made sense for it to be written later, but now it's earlier than what they have of some of the things that they thought were coming first. And so they are just kind of grasping at straws, as most biblical scholars do, when they're trying to prove exact moments in time. However, I think a lot of our, class members are pretty familiar with John and his brother James, and they show up a lot in this week. And so our kind of guiding questions center around James and John, and so will our closing question. Just some guiding questions. How can these examples of James and John encourage us as we undergo formation as disciples? And then kind of an introspective question to also be considering as we kind of walk through this is, what about James and John do you see in yourself? Is there that boldness to be quick to ask questions and not really think about the words you're saying when you're asking those questions? Is there those things of you're just so tied up in your own view of what's supposed to be happening that you kind of blank on everything else? And so that's kind of the guiding questions or guiding thoughts for this week. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started. If someone would like to read verses 28 through 36.
At 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. Two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and enveloped them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and told no one at that time what they had seen.
All right, thank you, Mike. So I know in the notes I put down 8 days after feeding the 5,000. It's possible that that's 8 days after that, but then I forgot we didn't end last week on just the feeding of the 5,000. There were a few things that happened after that, and so what we see is there's 8 days, and there's some significance to that just because usually you would think, oh, it's 7 days. On the 7th day, after something happens, that's a week. Why would you ever say 8? Well, part of this is because it's that idea of Sabbath. Jesus is taking a Sabbath in there. So if we were to assume the feeding of the 5,000 happened on a Sabbath day, which is very possible because they were trying to retreat and go into the presence of God at the time. 8 days later would be the first day after Sabbath. So Jesus is recognizing the Sabbath there. Or you could argue, no, it's just 8 other days and the Sabbath was not the day before or whatever. Or some might argue, well, if we're saying Sabbath practices mark when the Sabbath is, well, Jesus is about to take a Sabbath with Peter, James, and John. So wouldn't this now be the Sabbath? I think they're all good points, and it all is kind of gets at the same point of Jesus, even with all the ministry he's doing, with all of the miracles and all the blessings he's giving to people, he's still being intentional about taking time to go into the presence of God. And if it's and observe the Sabbath, whether that is by doing what would be culturally acceptable to do on the Sabbath, or kind of those Sabbath practices of going away into a garden or onto a mountain or into a quieted place, and that's where you are you're praying before God, you're bringing yourself before him. And several times we still see it kind of happen today.
Yes.
Of retreats kind of trying to accomplish the same thing. We're trying to get back to those Sabbath practices of we need to be praying more, we need to be going into the presence of God, we need to be leaving the distractions of everything we're doing. It's not that what we're doing is not important or isn't glorifying God. It's still important for us to still go out. And I just rambled about the Sabbath for probably a little bit too long. But that's okay.
Well, have you ever heard that Jesus was raised on the eighth day?
I have not heard that.
It's the eighth day after the triumphal entry, that Sunday, 8 days later, his first day of the week.
Yeah.
And so sometimes that eight, there may be some more meaning to it that way too,
That is possible. Yeah, I just haven't heard it that way, so I didn't make that connection. But I do think that is interesting because we are shifting towards at least viewing Jerusalem is in the distance on our kind of roadmap. We see it again like this week. It's constantly being reminded Jesus is going to die and he's going to be handed over to men. There is going to be a time when you disciples need to be leading the ministry, but we'll get to that story in a minute. I'm jumping the gun here. And so it could be definitely that reference back to the back to what happens in Jerusalem, because whatever audience Luke is writing to would still know the ending before they knew the rest of the story. Just because you can't make a confession and put on baptism, saying that you know Jesus died for your sins if you don't know that Jesus died for your sins. And so there's that possibility. But as they are retreating with Peter, James, and John, Jesus suddenly just starts glowing. His appearance changes. And my version says his clothes dazzled or was dazzling or dazzling white. Mike, did you say yours say his face was dazzling white?
His clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning.
Okay. So yours also describes the clothes? Okay. I must have just misheard it.
Oh, before that, it says the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning.
Okay, yeah. So that's kind of how mine does it. And I looked at a few and that's basically the same. I just wanted to make sure we didn't have a version saying his face was the thing that became bright. Because that would have been a completely different conversation. But good, at least most of the English translations we've referenced are saying it's his clothes. And there's a couple things going on. Some might say that his face changed in appearance. Some will look at Luke 24 with the road to Emmaus and how these two disciples who are traveling didn't recognize Christ. Well, some would point back to here and say, well, Jesus's face changed when his glory was shown to Peter, James, and John. And so that could be very possible that Jesus just has a different face when he's been glorified versus when he's in his human state, which is kind of weird to think about because it's then saying Jesus's face changes depending on what's going on, which isn't like impossible. It's just one of those weird things to like grasp of my face won't change no matter what is going on. I may make a different facial expression, but my nose is still going to be my nose. My cheeks are still going to be my cheeks. And so unless I put something over them or anything like that, my appearance isn't going to necessarily change in a way that, and maybe it's I'm just kind of going off here and I'm thinking a bit more of like, it was a drastic change. It may have just been, okay, his beard's not as wildly unkempt and his hair is now all combed and he looks well washed. Whereas maybe he's probably not the hygiene appearance of a first century Jew probably looks a little bit different than someone who has the perfect complexion, perfect hair, and perfect everything. Or it was always like that. It's just something else changed. But that's not really the point. The point's not his face changed. The real thing is his clothes shined or had some dazzling or became bright like lightning, because this is referencing prophetic imagery. We see it in Revelation, and we see it in Daniel, and I think Isaiah, and we also kind of see it in some of the throne room dialogues, in Job and the Psalms, when it's describing God in his throne room, is God is dressed in light. And so this is one of those moments of Peter, James, and John. If you had read your prophets and if you had really studied well, you should have been able to pick up, oh, Jesus is, yeah, we've identified him as the Messiah and the Christ, but now he is clothed with light. The only one who's ever described as clothed with light is God. All right, let's put two and two together. And so make the logical assumption, but we see that they're more focused on tents, but again, I'm jumping all over the place, and that's because there's a lot here, alongside Jesus, we see Moses and Elijah appear with him. Moses and Elijah are probably the two most compared figures to Jesus. Not in Luke's gospel. Luke really hits home the Elijah part, but kind of leaves Moses out of it. However, Matthew and Mark really try and draw more on the Moses part. And part of that makes more sense. Matthew's writing to a very Jewish audience. They would probably be quick to recognize Moses and the story of Moses. And so there's a little bit of that going on. I'm going to pause here. Do you guys have any comments before we continue just going through every little bit of the transfiguration?
Well, you mentioned tents. I think I read somewhere where that would be translated more like tabernacles or so rather than tents.
It's so tabernacle is a fancy word for tent, and it's a type of tent. But they would have been, to a Greek reader, they would have just identified it as a tent, unless it was a transliteration of the proper name tabernacle. But I do think there is probably something to be said that Luke is not hearing the story as this is just a camping tent. He's probably hearing this as, okay, describe the tabernacle to me. A Gentile who doesn't understand what the tabernacle is, because I haven't read the Exodus account or Numbers or Deuteronomy, where every little bit about the tabernacle has been highlighted. And so there's probably a little bit of that, but there is probably some value in recognizing that Peter's not just saying, let's just throw a tarp over some sticks and call it good. Peter is probably saying, let us build a place for the presence of Moses and Elijah and you to dwell in, similar to the tabernacle, which was built to let the presence of God dwell in. So I don't know if that was sufficient.
It was kosher to use a tent.
Yeah. We have like 5 languages going on here, and they all have different words.
Yeah.
It's interesting, that Moses and Elijah are the two in the Old Testament that also had mountaintop experiences with God.
Yeah. We're gonna get to there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Just before we get to the good part.
Yeah. Okay. Before the presence of God shows up, or God the Father.
And obviously they have name tags.
Oh yeah.
Well, it does say that Peter didn't know what he was saying,
Yes, absolutely.
so it's probably not Peter himself.
But they recognized who they were. Who the men were.
Which is interesting because they didn't have pictures.
Yeah, I'm thinking that it wasn't like Peter himself. It might have been like the Holy Spirit just enveloping itself into Peter and saying, "Hey, this is Moses and Elijah.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, Peter doesn't tell any of the gospel writers any of that, so,
Verse 30 says the two men were talking with him, talking to Jesus.
yeah.
So the three are sitting there, they're hearing that conversation going back and forth. So I feel fairly sure in the context of what they were hearing, they figured out that that was Moses and Elijah.
Yeah,
If they
Jesus was
didn't-
probably poking fun at, hey, remember that time you wrote the Ten
Yeah.
Commandments, or remember that time you struck the rock and couldn't enter the Holy Land because you didn't do what God said, or hey, Elijah, remember that time when you had to raise that widow's child from the dead because you messed up and didn't pray for her to have food at the right time? Yeah, I don't know. It could have been that, or Jesus probably could have just also turned and said, this is Moses and this is Elijah. It's one of those, we don't know.
Well, you don't know how long it took place either, because they were
No.
asleep at one point and then
Yeah.
fully awake, and
Yeah,
we just read it and think it happened just like that.
and it's one, because we'll, even later on, we'll also see, clearly it's been long enough that a crowd who wasn't there has now figured out where Jesus and his disciples are, and they all come to the bottom of the mountain and are just waiting for him. Because that's how the next section starts. But we'll go ahead and finish this section off. Mike kind of jumped the gun. Yes, Moses and Elijah also had mountaintop experiences, and it's very similar to this because with Mount Sinai, the presence of God comes down as a cloud onto the mountaintop, and that's where God and Moses meet. And likewise, Elijah has one of those experiences. Elijah has a lot of mountaintop experiences, but the one I'm thinking of happens in 1 Kings 19, or is it 18? One of them. I think it's 19, where he's fleeing from Ahab and Jezebel because he wound up the prophets of Baal, and now the presence of God has come onto this mountain and is trying to prove to Elijah, you're focusing on the wrong things. You're focusing on the storms and everything. That doesn't mean God's not there. God's not always in the big signs. He's in the small little things. But
It's 19.
okay. So yeah, in 1 Kings 19 that happens. But what we see also is not only is Jesus kind of the best version of Moses and Elijah, he also is always trying to, I wouldn't say ride their coattails, because he's not really riding them. He's just he's using it as ways to define his character. He's allowing people to make the connection of, oh, you're like Moses. And then once they have that hook on, like, okay, so you're like Moses, well, then he starts showing, well, I'm like Moses plus more. Oh, so you're like Elijah. Yes, but I'm more than Elijah, which I think probably would have made a lot of Jewish, students, Jewish followers, at least it'd be a very quick transition or an easy transition of, oh, well, I know what Moses says. I know Moses is a good guy. It would be a little bit harder for Gentiles because you're saying, oh, Jesus is like Moses and Elijah. And they'd be like, I may have heard about a thing Elijah did, and that's about it. And so this is one of those weird moments if we're where we kind of see the audience has some knowledge of the Old Testament that Luke's writing to, but it's not like a super in-depth understanding. And I included a few questions with this section which I'll touch on before we get to what Peter, James, and John do, or at least this first one, because I don't know if it's just I got tripped up because of the wording or what, but in the reading, it seems like Moses and Elijah were explaining to Jesus what's happening, But I don't think that's necessarily what happened. I don't know if that's just my brain was like, these words mean this, and I'm like, and they really don't. But the question is, why do you think Moses and Elijah were employed to explain what is about to happen to Christ?
Well, one thing, Jesus was God.
Yeah.
Elijah and Moses were friends of God. Elijah did not die. He was taken. Moses was taken and went up on the mountain, and according to scripture, he died. Nobody ever knew where he went, but God took care of whatever happened to him. So this would be a case of God bringing his best friends.
Yeah.
To stay and have a conversation about his departure. When you think about departure, when there's a departure, there's an arrival somewhere. Just like at the airport, you have two signs standing up, departures and arrivals. You're not going to have a departure up here unless there's an arrival, some other airport somewhere in the world that corresponds with it. So when you're talking about departure, talking about what is going to happen, where he's going to go, what is going to happen after, during and after this crucifixion. So if you ask why them, they were his best friends. According to scripture, I mean, the only other one it could possibly be up there would be maybe David.
Yeah.
But David wasn't treated special at the point of death like these two men were. And that's what I see in here, is these two men had something very special with God in the way that they were taken and were the way that Moses was died and what happened to him. So they were special to him. And so I look at it as he called his best friends together to talk about what he's fixing to go do, get encouragement from them, because they've been there, they've done that. Maybe they didn't die, I mean, they didn't take on the sins of the world, but they went through that transition from being a human into whatever this form is they are now. So, the humanness of Jesus could be seen in that as well. He's fixing to do something he's never done. He doesn't know. He is God, but he hasn't done that.
Yeah.
Only humans have done that up to this point. So that's kind of how I see that as to why they're there and what they're discussing. Because there's more to it than just him dying. It's the arrival, what's going to happen.
Right. And then we get to what Peter, James, and John are doing. It's described they are in a heavy sleep, which my first, I guess, conclusion is Jesus, whenever he pulls these people aside to pray, they sure can't stay awake for it. We see it, I don't know if that was understandable. They fall asleep a lot, is what I'm trying to say. They fall asleep here. They fell asleep on the boat. They fell asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane. Like his disciples like to sleep a lot, and it may just be Jesus doesn't sleep a lot, and so it's like a 21-hour day doesn't affect Jesus, but for Peter, he's probably dragging his feet for like 10 hours before he just falls asleep and misses the important part of the show.
Sounds like a teenager.
Yeah.
Up
Well,
all night and sleeping during the day.
I don't do that. I actually don't.
Oh,
21.
Not too many.
Not teenage anymore.
I would hope not.
I haven't changed any.
You haven't changed any?
No.
but I think not only is this a physical sleep, I think it's getting back to that idea of, I guess, a spiritual sleep. We haven't really seen this before, but Luke does like to bring up, you heard, but you didn't listen, or you listened and didn't understand. You saw, but you didn't see what was going on. And so I think this is another one of those analogies of you're asleep, you are missing the boat. This, like, the big show's happening over here, and you are off in La La Land, counting stars and sheep and whatever. But it's one of those, you are awake enough to understand what's happening. you're in this lower level, and as they're becoming fully awake, they slowly start to understand what's going on. This would be that point of they realize, oh, this is Jesus with Moses and Elijah. This has some significance here, and then, but it's still probably, no matter how much they explain it to them, they're still struggling. I think. Yeah, and then the presence of God comes onto the mountain, and this is God the Father now. God the Father and God the Son are in the same place, which makes it weird to think of Trinitarian theology, but okay. Anyway, the presence of God the Father comes down as a cloud, which, as we've already mentioned, isn't like the first time God uses a cloud to show the presence of. And this wouldn't even be foreign to Gentiles. They thought all the pagan gods that they worshipped also used clouds as a form of transport. But especially to someone who's at least familiar with the Exodus and Elijah's story, God is usually in the clouds. And so this is the presence of God coming onto a mountain. And God the Father has to tell them, you still aren't understanding. This is my son. He is going to die for you guys and your sins. Get it through your heads. And then everything kind of ended. And then we get this weird note of after God spoke, Peter, James, and John, it says they kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. And that leads us to the second question I came up with was, why do you think after what God, the Father, appears to a cloud and reveals who Jesus is, Peter, James, and John decide not to speak until later about what just happened?
They had an encounter with God and made complete idiots of themselves. And so they're very embarrassed.
I'm sure.
Isn't that how you want your first impression and cloud with God to be?
Yeah.
Could be too that they felt not sure until later.
Yeah. They still lacked understanding.
Yeah,
Did it really happen?
you're right.
They were still trying to reconcile the fact that Jesus was headed towards a pretty soon death.
Mhm.
And that, it's Jesus's place to make that revelation and do that. So I can see why they held off. Because it says they talked about it until later.
Mhm.
So later, eventually they talked about it,
Right.
but
Yeah.
not until they had a little more perspective.
And what most people take that line of later meaning is once Jesus died and all the puzzle pieces just kind of fit together. We know at least Peter had that moment kind of early on with Acts 2. Peter on the day of Pentecost, everything just seems to like click, and he's like, oh yeah, we knew what was going on, we knew what had happened, but we still didn't understand until now, or at least not enough to really preach on it in the way he does. But there's still that learning and development. It's interesting to kind of track. They knew nothing, and then for so long they still didn't know anything, even though they just kept getting told point blank, this is going to happen. And then it's not until Acts that we really see them to start to understand it, and the full picture of being able to truly lead as disciples. I think that's long enough on the Mount of the Transfiguration. That was only 40 minutes. And we have like the entire rest of the lesson to get through. So we'll go ahead and pick up the pace. If someone would like to read verses 37 through 48, 3, and just the first bit, 43.
The next day, when he had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met. And behold, a man from the crowd cried out, Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child. And beheld, a spirit seizes him, and he suddenly cries out. It convulses him so that he foams at the mouth, and it shatters him, and will hardly leave him. And I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here. While he was coming, the demon threw him to the ground and convulsed him. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit and healed the boy and gave him back to his father. And all were astonished at the majesty of God.
Thank you. So almost instantly after coming out of this time of rest, this time where Jesus and the three troublemakers, I guess, come out of this time of rest and being in the presence of God and being in several forms of the presence of God, they're immediately met with work. And a crowd has already come and gathered at the foot of the mountain. And out of this crowd, a man calls out about a son who's afflicted with demons. And we see his disciples, he went to his disciples first, and his disciples were powerless. And this causes Jesus to cry out, "Oh, you wicked generation." And yes, you could say he's rebuking the entire crowd. But I think a lot of this is also directed straight at the disciples, because the disciples were given the power and authority to cast out demons at the end of chapter 8 and the start of chapter 9. And so before they went on their missionary journeys, they had the power, and they go out and they go to everywhere and they cast out demons. And now a demon-possessed boy is brought to them and they can't do it. And so I think there's a little bit of this of, it probably hurt the disciples a little bit more to be told, "Oh, you wicked generation," a little bit more than it just affected the crowd. The crowd was like, okay. They knew that there was sinfulness, or that they weren't doing the best job that they possibly could, but it probably hurt the disciples a little bit more. And I do think there is something to be said about that. But I also opened this up for questions of, and we don't necessarily have to discuss them, but the two questions I included in the handout were, what does faith have to do with casting out demons? And then the second one is, why might the disciples lack the ability to cast out demons, even though they were able to do so earlier in the chapter?
Maybe the same reason why the Israelites lost at Ai after they beat Jericho. They started relying on themselves instead of on God.
Yeah.
Well, I think about when did they try to do that? Probably right then.
Mhm.
You have this multitude that they're all here. And what I visualize is the disciples probably were spread out a little bit, and different people were coming to him for different things. And this dad's just coming, he's like, he goes up to whoever, whichever one of them, and says, "Hey, take care of this," and he couldn't do it. And then they turn around and then they go to Jesus. I mean, that's what I do when I get, if I go to a store and I don't get satisfaction, I'm looking for the manager. And so I think they kind of went over his head a little bit, and they went to Jesus. And I think Jesus is, I mean, just like what you implied and talked about, he's talking to his disciples, his apostles, when he says, "How long am I going to put up with you guys?
Mhm.
I told you could do this, but you're not doing it." So I mean, I think I think there's a lot of this chapter. He's talking directly to his apostles, and everybody else is just kind of listening in and getting to hear it. But he's wanting them to gain the confidence and become, he wants them to, he's pushing them out of the nest and getting them ready to fly on their own. That's all I'm saying with it.
That kind of leads us to our, the next section, which is I guess, a verse and a half long, and so I'll go ahead and read that one. It reads, but while they were marveling at everything he was doing, Jesus said to his disciples, let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is about to be delivered to the hands of men. But they did not understand this saying, and it was concealed from them, so that they might not perceive it. And they are afraid to ask him about this saying. So Jesus heals the boy. I'm sure there's a lot of pats on the backs. Everyone's excited. A child's just been healed. This is great news. And Jesus kind of looks to his disciples and explains, one, he already hinted at it. How long will I have to be with you for you to understand this? And for the second time to the entire group of his disciples, he says, I will have to be handed over into the hands of men. I will be handed over to my death, like an animal would be handed over to a butcher. And you don't understand this at all. And he's using strong word. He uses strong, plain language, which I think of when you're in a public school setting. If your teacher is using strong and plain language, they're they've run out of patience. They are giving up on what's like trying to work through all the details about this with you. They just want you to get through your head this sentence so that we can move on. And Jesus does the same thing. Get it through your head. This is going to happen. You need to recognize this. And he even says, let it sink into your ears. And it's one of those, they heard it, but they weren't really listening. They didn't understand. They didn't get that comprehension. And because of the sternness of the message, they kind of get scared and they don't say anything. They don't ask him about it again until the third time this happens, which is interesting because Peter, James, and John, this is their third time because they got told this on the mountain, and now they're being told this at the base of the mountain. And so it is always one of those weird, okay, Peter, James, and John are always pulled aside. Is that because they're stronger leaders, better apostles, or is it because they're okay, you're really not getting this and I need to pull you aside and teach it to you one-on-one or in a small group for you to really start to grasp this? I think you could make a case for both because Peter, James, and John, we see are strong leaders. They lead the church in Jerusalem. They lead missionary journeys. One of them writes a gospel. But then we also see they are, I don't know if it's much slower at grasping it, where they're just the ones who are not foolish enough, because it's not foolish to ask questions, but they open their mouth more, and so they have to get taught more. If you don't want to get called on where you don't ask questions, you kind of just sink into the background. But we see that this is kind of happening, and the very next two sections, they open their mouth and they have to get this kind of one-on-one discussion. And since we're low on time, I'll go ahead and read it. But what do you guys have to say on any of this with the healing of the son or Jesus foretelling his death for a second time?
I don't think I'd do any better if I was there. That would not make any sense. I'd have more questions.
Well, it says it was actually concealed from them.
Yeah, I mean,
You know, I think they still haven't been introduced to the Spirit. They don't have that concept yet. That hasn't happened to them yet. So I think it's things like that and words like that. I really believe the Spirit indwelling to them was almost like a photographic memory. And all of a sudden, they've got instant recall of something that Jesus said, and all of a sudden, the light came on.
like this.
Yeah, and they probably immediately knew. They knew. I mean, how many times did he tell them, "I'm about to die. I'm the lamb. I'm going to be betrayed." And they're all, in the moment of where they're at, they weren't grasping that. They didn't understand that. This guy's the most popular guy in town. How can he possibly be killed? I mean, they had no idea what was coming. And he did, he kept foreshadowing it. But I think when it says it was their understanding was concealed from them, they didn't get it right then. But the whole reason this is recorded, and it is recorded and recalled later, because they connected the dots and they realized what was being done.
The next two sections are more of the same. Yes, they like asking questions, and Jesus likes proving them wrong. Not proving them wrong, answering their questions with a little bit more criticism, because you're a disciple of Christ. You should know this, and you're not getting it. And so I'll read 46 through 48, and then we'll talk about it, and then I'll read 49 and 50. But 46 to 48 reads, an argument arose among them as to which of them was the greatest. But Jesus, knowing the reason of their hearts, took a child and put him by his side and said to them, whoever receives this child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives him who sent me. For he who is least among you is the one who is great. I messed up. I'm just noticing now in the handout I put 2. It's technically 3 verses, but these 3 verses are kind of the crux of what we're trying to get at in the study. Luke likes to highlight this of Jesus goes to the least of these, but even more, it's this section was really what I tried to build the whole study for the quarter around, and it's this idea of you are supposed to be like children. We see it even now. Children aren't as valuable as adults. If you ask anyone, sports-wise, fame-wise, they all name adults. There's very few babies that have a whole lot of importance. They're only important because of who their parents are. But what we see is even in Greek and Roman and Jewish cultures, you'd see children are lower. A whole lot more of the beggars would have been children than adults, just because that's why they have the church started orphanages, and they were considered to be eating children in the early days, because they would pick up children off the street and bring them into the church. And so that's a completely side thing, other than the culture did not value children. And we even see it today, they're considered less than adults. But Jesus says you have to be like children. You have to become the least of the least, because a poor child is way less important in this culture than a poor adult. And so even the poor adults were still better than the children that are poor. And so we see this, and kind of the question is, we're supposed to be like children. We're supposed to accept God. But the comment or question I wanted to pose is, how can we as adults help encourage and raise children in our congregation in their walks of faith? Because Jesus seems to make it pretty clear, children get this. You're understanding, because you're focusing on all of the adult problems, you're focusing on way too much. The children get this, they're quick, they have greater faith, they understand this, so you need to be like them. So since we are all men of the faith, and our classes are filled with adults in the faith, or at least they recognize that some relationship with Christ, how can we then take our role as adults, and as we are more like children, how can we help those children in our classes, in our church, in our congregation, with some of this stuff? Again, we don't have to necessarily discuss it unless you guys want to.
It's just funny because as I read this, what just happened, they're acting like children
Oh, yeah.
because, you know, you're trying to explain to your kid that grandpa's got cancer and grandpa's gonna die. And your kid responds, can we go to McDonald's then? You know, it's like, what? I'm telling you something's important.
Mhm.
And here they're arguing about who's gonna be the greatest.
Yeah.
And they're missing it. And so I think to answer your question, we need to be adults, but we need to be spiritual adults instead of immature adults. That's what we need to teach our kids.
All right, and then the last section, this one is from, at least in Luke's gospel, it's told to us that this is John. And I think one of the other gospels, that last section was James and John approached Jesus. But in this one, this is for sure John and Luke's gospel. And starting in verse 49, John answered, Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he does not follow with us. But Jesus said to him, do not stop him, for the one who is not against you is for you. In this section, of course, John says, well, we found someone who claims to be one of your followers and who's doing this miracle, this work of ministry of casting out demons, but we stopped him because he wasn't following you like we follow you. And that comes to the question of, do we often do the same thing? Are we often quick to say, well, you're not following Jesus the right way, so you can't, I'm going to discourage you. I'm going to say you can't do this because of, well, you go to Broadway Church of Christ and you don't go to Greenlawn Church of Christ, or you go to Sunset Church of Christ and not Monterey Church of Christ, or do we often discourage just people based off of the name on a building or the small things, whether it's that has any impact on what they're teaching or what they're really trying to accomplish, just because of those small differences. My favorite one is always, and I know some people here also wouldn't fall into this, but growing up, my church I grew up in wasn't too far from a Catholic church. And I would hear almost every Sunday, someone would complain that the Catholic church was feeding people. And it was basically a soup kitchen. And it was one of those things of, does it matter what's happening? They are feeding people and talking to them about Jesus. Does it matter if it's a Catholic church or a Church of Christ? Does it matter? Like, are we not trying to say the differences in denominations are good or bad, or we should just all become one denomination again, because that's ridiculous and whatever. But it's that idea of like, are we hindering someone else's ministry just because they're not the exact same person as us? And I think Jesus would say it doesn't. Like, you should not be fighting one another because they're still feeding people who are hungry. They're still helping those. And even if we come to learn all the Catholics had several steps wrong or whatever, they're still at least started the path for someone of knowing who Christ is, knowing who God is, just like churches here, or churches of Christ, or Baptist churches, or whatever. I'm sorry, that's a soapbox of mine, and I'm trying not to do that, but the Gospels have so many soapboxes that are so easy to get on. But the closing thought that I'll be leaving my class with, and I encourage you guys to leave your classes with, is John and James are great examples of what it means to be a disciple. But that doesn't mean they didn't make mistakes, or that they always knew what was going on, or understood what Jesus said. And this week, what ways could you be like James and John this week? James and John do a lot of great things for the church. They also do some pretty human things of, they don't understand, they don't listen right, they are quick to open their mouth. And there's good that can come from that. But in what ways could we be doing good like James and John in our week? That's what I got. Go ahead and make it your own. Thank you for class.